Abby, it's Monday, and I think we can all agree that political elections, especially presidential elections, are insane. And I think we can all agree that the most insane thing about them are the attack ads. I remember when I lived in Wisconsin, there was this one commercial that had like this congressman guy in a hole, and he was like, Washington's in a hole, and I'm the only person who can dig it out. And I'm just like, dude, what are you doing with your life? You're in a hole, speaking to a television camera. I don't want you representing my state. Please leave. And here in Illinois, there was a commercial running against this guy who was running for governor, and they claimed that he supposedly removed all of the toilets from one of his mansions so that it wouldn't count as a house and he wouldn't have to pay property taxes for it. And so he was granted the nickname of the Porcelain Prince. All of these ridiculous and borderline slanderous attack ads can almost make you wish for a simpler time when America was young, civil, and not politically divided at all. Clearly, you have never heard of the election of 1800. So now I'm going to tell you about it. Like, a lot about it. Too much about it. Let's go! Unfortunately, before I can actually talk about the actual election of 1800, I have to talk about, like, all of the stuff that happened before it, because a surprising amount of historical context is needed to properly understand this election. So, yeah, there's gonna be a lot of historical context here. It's like a lot, but, like, I promise it is all relevant. So George Washington was America's first president, right? He served his 2 terms, and then he was like, all right, I have, like, established how we expect our president to basically act. I have set up, like, the most basic things about the executive branch of government. I've, like, laid the baseline for everybody to follow. But here's the thing. I'm tired. I'm just gonna go back to Mount Vernon and chill with my wife, and, like, I'm just gonna leave this up to you guys. You kids have fun. Please do not end up killing each other. I am begging you. In Washington's farewell address, he specifically warned America to not form political parties. And then Thomas Jefferson literally wrote to him in a letter, if I have to go to heaven with a political party, then I'm not going to heaven at all. Thomas Jefferson then immediately proceeded to become the major figurehead of one of America's major political parties. Great job, Mr. Jefferson! A huge divide soon formed between America's 2 major political parties, the Federalists, championed by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. I don't have the time to get into all of the specific differences between the 2 parties right now, but basically back when everyone was trying to get the Constitution ratified, the Federalists were the people who were in support of just passing it as is, and the Democratic Republicans were more in support of adding a Bill of Rights to it first, and all of the differences between the 2 parties tend to just, like, branch out from there. During the election of 1796, both parties chose to nominate former members of Washington's cabinet. The Democratic Republicans chose Thomas Jefferson, who had previously served as Washington's Secretary of State, and the Federalists chose John Adams, who had served as Vice President, much to the annoyance of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton really did not like Thomas Jefferson. In Hamilton's eyes, Jefferson was basically just everything wrong with the world personified, and the 2 were basically just complete opposites, and it's great. Hamilton was born an illegitimate child and later became an orphan and grew up in the West Indies, or what we would nowadays call the Caribbean, so he basically just grew up dirt poor. Jefferson was born into a very wealthy family in Virginia. Jefferson owned hundreds of slaves, even though he claimed to be against slavery. Hamilton was an abolitionist and never owned a slave in his life. Hamilton believed that the Constitution should be interpreted in many different ways and fought hard for its ratification, while Jefferson believed that the Constitution should be read as literally as possible and would not let it pass without a Bill of Rights. And Jefferson was fairly introverted and didn't really like media attention, and Hamilton, though he was actually somewhat introverted in his private life, in his public life, he literally never shut up. Like, ever. The 2 were just complete opposites, a perfect storm of political and personal disagreements. You might think that since Hamilton and Adams had more in common, that they would get along better than Hamilton got along with Jefferson. In that assumption, you would be very Very wrong. It turns out that the Federalist Party wasn't just satisfied with going to war with the Democratic Republicans, they had to go to war with themselves. The party very quickly split into two groups, with half of the party more favoring Hamilton's political opinions, and half of the party aligning more with Adams. Hamilton believed in putting a lot of focus on a strong central federal government, especially in the economy, but Adams believed that Hamilton's ideas would be very open to corruption by the upper class, which would just hurt society's poorer citizens even more than they were already being harmed. Over the years, Adams and Hamilton made their dislike of each other very clear, both to each other and to other people. Adams once wrote of Hamilton, "Although I have long since forgiven this archenemy, yet vice, folly, and villainy are not to be forgotten because the guilty wretch repented in his dying moments. Born on a speck more obscure than Corsica, from an original not only contemptible but infamous, with infinitely less courage and capacity than Bonaparte, he would, in my opinion, if I had not controlled the fury of his vanity, instead of relieving this country from confusion as Bonaparte did France, he would have involved it in all the bloodshed and distractions of foreign and civil wars at once." Wow. There's also kind of a whole thing with John Adams' son, Charles. Basically, he sent Charles to go be an apprentice to Hamilton, and then after Charles came back, Adams realized that his son was either gay or bisexual. Historians can't decide. But anyway, Adams then, after that, wrote a lot of very angry letters to Hamilton for, like, no particular reason. So it's possible that Adams may have suspected that Hamilton was bisexual. Oh, by the way, if you didn't know that, Alexander Hamilton was bisexual, but that's besides the point. It's possible that John Adams may have suspected of this, and then once he realized that his son was as well, he decided to blame Hamilton for, like, infecting his son with the gay or something. Also, I wasn't able to find a source for this, but apparently at one point Adams claimed that Hamilton was incapable of making sound decisions because his brain was full of a certain white substance that I'm not going to explicitly name. All of my fellow Hamilton stans may have heard all these sick burns from John Adams and been like, hey, where is Hamilton's verse in this cabinet battle? Don't worry, friends. We're gonna get there. When the election of 1796 happened and the Federalists were considering nominating Adams, Hamilton tried very, very hard to convince them to do otherwise. He was like, guys, please, not Adams. I can't stand this man. Please, anyone other than Adams, I don't care. Oh, who would I recommend? Well, I mean, I don't know, but maybe, I don't know, me. If you guys wanted to, but I'm no pressure. You guys just pick whoever you want as long as they are not John Adams. Please, just not John Adams and also possibly me, but not John Adams. However, the Federalists decided to go against Hamilton's wishes, and Adams and Jefferson went up against each other in the presidential election. It was a very close election, with Adams winning the Electoral College by just 3 votes, but the Federalists did prevail. However, the Electoral College was weird back then. It's weird now, but it was even weirder back then. So, nowadays, the electors will vote for one ballot for the president and one other ballot for the vice president, and they are completely separate things and they don't interact. However, back then, the electors would just vote on one big ballot and they would vote for 2 people, and then whoever got the most votes would become president, and whoever got the second most votes would become vice president. This is very obviously a terrible idea because you will almost always end up with the president and the vice president having the exact opposite political views, which means that literally nothing will get accomplished ever. To make things even more stupidly convoluted, the people running for president would still pick running mates that they wanted to be their vice, even though it's extremely unlikely that that person will even end up being your vice anyway. Who at the Constitutional Convention thought this was going to be a good idea? It's almost like both the Constitution and the Electoral College weren't designed with political parties in mind, which was the exact reason why George Washington warned us to not form them in the first place, but apparently he just stuttered his way through his entire farewell address because we all just decided to not listen to him at all, and yes, I will eventually talk about the election of 1800 in this video, I promise. The point of that is that John Adams became the president and Thomas Jefferson became his vice president, even though they agreed on nothing politically. With this newly elected president came a newly elected Congress, which was controlled mostly by Hamilton's faction of the Federalists. So all of a sudden, Congress starts going up to John Adams and being like, hey, Mr. President, you know who in your cabinet you should listen to a whole bunch? Your Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. But unfortunately for Congress, both Adams and Jefferson hated every single minuscule fiber of Alexander Hamilton's being with the fury of 1,000 suns, and Hamilton was dismissed from his position about a year into Adams' presidency. Hamilton was approximately 900% done with both Adams and Jefferson at this point anyway, and he was receiving a lot of bad press at the moment because he kind of cheated on his wife and then wrote a 100-page pamphlet about it. Yeah, that's a thing. We're gonna come back to that. So Hamilton and his family moved back to New York to just chill. Or at least attempt to chill. I'm pretty sure that Alexander Hamilton was, like, physically incapable of relaxing. Although he never ran for any political offices, he did become a successful lawyer and a prominent Federalist political machine, or a person who heavily influences politics without being directly involved in it. However, Hamilton just can't be left alone because there's another prominent political machine in New York that serves the Democratic Republicans, and its name is Mr. Aaron Burr, sir. Aaron Burr was this dude who, like Hamilton, served in the army during the Revolutionary War, and then he did some low-level political stuff in New York, but, like, never became super prominent, and then he became a senator, and surprise, surprise, like almost everyone in this story, he was not the biggest fan of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton viewed Burr as, like, what you imagine when you think of a shady politician. He thought that Burr just always switched his opinion to be whatever the majority of his constituents thought rather than what he actually believed. And he thought that Burr wasn't actually in it to try and serve his country or make it better in any way. He thought Burr was just in it for the power and notoriety involved. And Hamilton resented that kind of bullcrap 1,000 times more than he could ever resent Adams or Jefferson. And Burr didn't like Hamilton because Hamilton was going around talking smack about Burr to everyone. So yeah, now we have Hamilton and Burr, both in New York City, both heavily influencing each other's political parties that oppose each other, and just hating each other more every single minute of every single day. This isn't going to end badly for anyone involved at all. Meanwhile, at the Adams administration, even though they disagreed politically so much, Adams and Jefferson were, like, kind of best friends at this point. Because, like, although we traditionally assign Jefferson all of the credit for writing the Declaration of Independence, it is believed that Adams had, like, a lot of influence on him when he was writing it, so Adams is sometimes credited as, like, a secondary author to the document. And they both signed the Declaration, and they, like, wrote each other a bunch of letters, and they talked a lot. So, like, they were just bros, and although they disagreed politically, they were still able to remain friends over it. All of that went straight out the window as soon as the two were forced to work together in government. During Adams' presidency, there were two main issues that the two disagreed on: the French Revolution and the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Can you hear the common sing? It is a song of angry people saying that I can't sing and don't know anything about the French Revolution.
So at this point, the French Revolution had not, like, formally kicked off, but, like, there was still a lot of people, like, trying to make it happen. Like, there were protests in the street, people were getting attacked. No one was getting guillotined yet, but, like, they were heading there pretty soon. England was like, yo, France, like, are you okay? And they tried to stop the French from basically just imploding it upon themselves, and the French responded by declaring war on the English, because that's a good thing to do when your country is in a very turbulent and unstable state. Good job, France. The Federalists were appalled by all of the violence happening in France, so they tried to get Adams to ally with the British to stop the revolution, but then the Democratic Republicans thought that making an alliance with Great Britain was dangerous, since we, like, you know, just broke away from them like 20 years ago, and so then the Democratic Republicans started accusing the Federalists of wanting to, like, turn back time and undo the revolution and turn America into part of the English monarchy again, which, like, that's 100% not what they said at all, but, like, okay then. Adams just wanted to remain neutral for the whole conflict, but then France was like, yo, America, if you don't ally with us, then we're just gonna make it impossible for you to trade with England. And then America was like, yeah, sure you will. Okay then, buddy. But then France started just blowing up any American ships that they saw heading in even the general direction of England. Everyone was understandably upset about this, but the most angered were Hamilton's branch of the Federalists. They began pushing Adams to team up with England and go to war on France together, but Adams was just not in the mood for a war just then, so he sent peace envoys to Paris instead. Even though Adams already had half of his own party hating him, he decided to go and tick off the Democratic Republicans as well by passing the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts gave the federal government the power to arrest or fine anyone speaking slander or false statements about the United States government and its officials. However, the Democratic Republicans viewed this as an excuse for Adams to just lock up anyone who dared to criticize him by claiming that their statements were slander. You know, like a fascist. The Alien and Sedition Acts were the absolute last straw for Jefferson, and if you are the president, you probably do not want your vice angry at you because the vice, 1, has great influence over the Senate, and B, constitutionally is the only person in your cabinet that you are not allowed to fire. By the time the election of 1800 rolled around, Jefferson had it up to here with Adams' crap, and he decided that he just had to run for president just so that Adams would not be granted a second term. America found itself in a situation that it has not yet experienced since. An incumbent president was forced to run against his own vice president. And now, we have finally reached the thing that this video is titled after. Is anyone still watching this? Because of the way the Electoral College worked, every party had to nominate 2 people, one that they preferred more over the other, who would be like their president, and then just a second guy who I guess was their pick for vice president, and then the 2 like kind of served as running mates for each other, but like not really. As I said, it's super confusing, don't question it. The Democratic Republicans chose Thomas Jefferson for their top pick because, you know, who else would you choose? And for his running mate, they chose Mr. Aaron Burr, sir. The Federalists chose John Adams for their top pick, and for his running mate, they chose this guy, Charles Pinckney, who has barely done anything relevant in his entire life. Like, okay, he was in the Revolutionary War, which is cool, and apparently he did sit in at the Constitutional Convention, although I don't know for how long and how much influence he had there. He went on some diplomatic missions to France at one point. I think he married John Lawrence's sister, but otherwise he's generally irrelevant to this entire story, so just, like, make a vague note of his existence and then just move on. The election of 1800 was the first time that people running for president, like, actively campaigned. Like, before this, literally everyone in the entire United States wanted George Washington to be president, and they figured that, like, John Adams would probably do an alright job after him, so no one was, like, too worried. But in this new, visceral political climate, if Jefferson and Adams really wanted the presidency, they were going to have to fight for it. However, when we think of campaigning, we imagine politicians going on crazy nationwide tours and using AC/DC songs illegally and shaking hands and kissing babies and meeting with random Iowa pig farmers and stuff like that. But back in that day, parading yourself around asking for people's votes was considered quite pompous because, you know, why would you want to let the people of your country know that you're running for president and what you would plan to do if elected? Like, that's just, why would we want our populace to be informed? Like, that's just crazy, man. The 1800s way of campaigning involved sitting down, writing a letter about, like, who you were and your political opinions and what you plan to do if elected and whatnot, and then you would just, like, submit it into a newspaper, and then they would publish it, and everyone would be allowed to read it. It sounds good on paper, but the problem is, literally every single newspaper back then was ridiculously biased to one side or the other. There was absolutely no middle ground in the press. So if you're one of those people who's freaking out about how America's so divided and we're not a more perfect union anymore or whatever, like, just be comforted by the fact that it's pretty much always been this way, and, like, it's no one's fault in particular. Certain people have exaggerated it, but no one, like, directly caused it. And, you know, this is just kind of how America and civilization in general tends to end up working. Unfortunately, these overly biased papers meant that there was no good way for American citizens to get a moderate opinion on, like, anything. Also, the press would often print speculative, sensationalized, or often just straight up false statements and treat them as absolute perfect truth with no flaws whatsoever. I haven't been able to find a direct source for what I'm about to say, so fair warning, what I'm about to say might be slightly inaccurate, but basically, apparently a Democratic Republican newspaper put out rumors that Adams was having prostitutes shipped in from overseas, and the Federalist responded by releasing a rumor that Jefferson had died so that people would think that they had to vote for Adams. Hey, you may disagree with literally every word that has ever come out of my mouth, but at the very least, I am actually alive and therefore physically capable of performing the duties of president. Unlike my good friend Tommy Jeffs over there, vote for John Adams, 1800, I'm out. The conflicts with France and the Alien and Sedition Acts were, of course, huge talking points in this election, but one of the points that was brought up often, even though it really wasn't that significant, was religion, specifically Jefferson's views on it. Jefferson claimed to be a Christian, and he probably was, but he was also very skeptical of certain aspects of the Bible, and back in those days, daring to question anything that the Bible said at all immediately won you accusations of being an atheist, and an atheist was not a great thing to be in early America. Combine this with the fact that Jefferson A. wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which explicitly mentioned freedom of religion a lot, B. campaigned for the First Amendment, which of course included the freedom of religion in it, and C. once stated that he didn't care what religion the person sitting next to him practiced because, you know, it didn't actually affect him in any way, and a lot of people on the Federalist side of the aisle started making it appear as if Jefferson was like Satan himself. People began claiming that a Jefferson presidency would not allow people to practice Christianity, which, like, okay, first of all, that's not even what he said, like, at all. And two, Jefferson always interprets the Constitution as literally as freaking possible, and the First Amendment explicitly condemns that. So, like, calm down. Beyond the whole atheism thing, Jefferson was also accused of being a hypocrite and a coward because he claimed to be a valiant patriot, but he had actually never fought in the American Revolution like Washington and Hamilton had. The minority of the populace that were abolitionists also didn't like Jefferson because he wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and he even included a line condemning slavery in his original draft of that document, and yet he was one of America's most prominent slaveholders, and as a result of that, one of its most wealthy men. So basically, the Federalist press painted Jefferson as a privileged, godless hypocrite who was in love with France, wanted to limit the government so much that it wouldn't be able to do anything, and would doom America to burning in hell for 1,000 years. Likewise, Adams was shown as a paragon of Christianity, who had brokered peace with France without treating America like a doormat, let the government get things done, and keep the country shining under God's holy grace for the rest of its days. However, the Democratic Republican press was not going to take this sitting down. They painted Adams as a crazed dictator-like figure who wanted to strip away everyone's constitutional rights, and the half of the Federalist Party that wanted to ally with England were actually secret loyalists who wanted to turn America back into British colonies. Oh my God, are you outraged yet? Meanwhile, Jefferson was portrayed as a calm patriot and proud Virginian who would never let anyone strip away your First Amendment rights or force you to be a British subject. But if the Democratic Republican press needed any assistance in making the Federalists look bad, they certainly got it from James Callender and Alexander Hamilton. My favorite thing about Alexander Hamilton's involvement in the election of 1800 is that he technically didn't need to be in this story. He could have just sat there in New York with his head down, just being a lawyer and trying to be a good husband to his wife, even though he cheated on her. But anyway, he could have just, you know, chilled in New York. But no, he just had to take his quill pen and dip it into that inkwell and start all kinds of drama, because that's literally what Alexander Hamilton does. So Hamilton and two of his friends were, like, writing back and forth, just venting about John Adams. And then Hamilton was like, hey, what if I wrote down all of my formal complaints about Adams and then published them for everyone in America to read? At first, Hamilton's friends were like, heck yeah, man, please do this. And then they were like, well, like, maybe just don't make people think you were politically motivated to do this or anything. And then they were like, you know what, maybe just, like, publish it anonymously or something? And then by the time the thing was done, they were just like, bro, don't do it. However, trying to tell Alexander Hamilton to stop writing something is a bit like trying to stop a train from moving by standing on the side of the tracks and yelling at it. It's nothing but an exhausting waste of time. So Hamilton writes a 54-page letter that's basically just him ranting and raving about how much he just absolutely hates John Adams. The letter's formal name is this gigantic long thing that I don't feel like saying aloud, but for reasons that will become apparent later, and because I think I'm funny, I will be referring to this document as the Adams pamphlet. I have not read the Adams pamphlet in its entirety, although I wish to someday, but like, I'm trying to get this video done by, like, Easter, so, I just don't have the time for that right now. So, I decided to just briefly skim it until I could find a burn that I considered savage enough to share with you all. I did not have to skim for very long. Hamilton is talking about how when the two first met for, like, cabinet meetings and stuff, Adams was trying to be nice to Hamilton, but Hamilton could tell that he was being fake, and therefore he had absolutely no qualms about furiously judging Adams, like, immediately. But this did not hinder me from making careful observations upon his several communications, and endeavoring to derive from them an accurate idea of his talents and character. This scrutiny enhanced my esteem in the main for his moral qualifications, but lessened my respect for his intellectual endowments. I then adopted an opinion, which all my subsequent experiences confirmed, that he is a man of an imagination sublimated and eccentric, propitious neither to the regular display of sound judgment nor to steady perseverance in a systematic plan of conduct, and I began to perceive what has been since too manifest, that to this defect are added the unfortunate foibles of a vanity without bounds and a jealousy capable of discoloring every object. Oh, Hamilton, even when you're roasting someone, you're just so eloquent. I love you. Hamilton goes on to tell of the single greatest historical screw-up I have ever had the pleasure of reading about. So while he was vice president, Adams was sent to go on this diplomacy trip to France, and he sent back this, like, progress report thing to Congress. With it, he accidentally included pages from his personal diary, but Congress didn't realize that it was sent by accident, so there's just some guy in Congress standing up there reading John Adams' diary aloud to everyone else in Congress while everyone just mutually tries not to die from secondhand embarrassment. Of this fiasco, Hamilton writes, the particulars of this journal cannot be expected to have remained in my memory, but I recollect one which may serve as an example. Being among the guests invited to dine with the Count de Vergennes, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Adams thought fit to give a specimen of American politeness by conducting Madame de Vergennes to dinner. In the way, she was pleased to make retribution in the current coin of French politeness, by saying to him, Mr. Adams, you are the Washington of negotiation. Stating the incident, he makes this comment upon it. These people have a very pretty knack of playing compliments. He might have added, they have also a very dexterous knack of disguising a sarcasm. I don't even know John Adams personally. I don't even really like John Adams as a historical figure, and yet I am still just dying from the secondhand cringe. It's so strong with this. Considering that whole fiasco takes place like 16 paragraphs into this 54-page letter, you may think that a better name for the Adams pamphlet would be, now that's what I call the death of John Adams' political career. Although this letter may have influenced some people's opinions of Adams, it actually ended up being more the death of Hamilton's political career more than anyone else's. For one thing, many people already disliked Hamilton as a politician, both because of that whole affair thing that I mentioned earlier and just his general disposition as a human being. This letter just gave those people even more evidence to back up their claims that Hamilton was a crazy, unlikable rage monster who was impossible to work with. Also, the letter just lengthened the already wide gap between the two halves of the Federalist Party and pretty much doomed any hopes that Hamilton had of replacing Adams as the party's leader. And the Federalist Party would eventually dissolve away into nothingness due to its lack of unity, partly because of this letter. An expose that was actually damning to Adams' political career would eventually be released. However, it would be full of straight-up lies, whereas the Adams pamphlet was just full of exaggerations and highly opinionated statements. America! So there's this this dude called James Callender, and he's what they call a hatchet man. Basically, he just sits there and writes very false and exaggerated criticisms of everyone around him. He's a hatchet man for hire. He will write anything about anybody, no matter how much of a lie it is and no matter what political party they're from. Basically, just imagine him as early America's version of Rita Skeeter. Up to this point, Callender's most prominent success was almost getting to break America's first political sex scandal until the person involved in said sex scandal just decided to break the story himself. And who else would that himself be but Alexander freaking Hamilton? So basically, Hamilton had an affair with this lady, and then the lady's husband found out, and the guy basically decided to turn his wife into a prostitute. He's like, yo, if you pay me money, I'll let you sleep with my wife. And Hamilton was like, all right, because he's a freaking idiot. So then eventually Congress finds out about this, and they think that Hamilton is like money laundering or something, so they send 3 dudes to go check it out. And then Hamilton's like, no, I am not money laundering. I am, however, cheating on my wife. Would you like to see? And he basically just throws a bunch of evidence proving that he cheated on his wife in their faces. And then he's like, hey, can you like not tell anybody about this? And all the dudes promise to do it, but then one of them is like, psych, and then he runs over to James Callender, tells him the whole thing. In one of James Callender's stories, at the end, he puts a thing like, oh, is Alexander Hamilton an agent of James Reynolds, the dude whose wife he slept with? Oh, I'll find out tomorrow. And then Hamilton's like, oh my god, so I have a choice. I can either let people accuse me of money laundering, or I can write a 95-page pamphlet telling everyone in detail about how I cheated on my wife. I think I'll take the second option, and I'll call it the Reynolds pamphlet. After that whole fiasco, James Callender gains even more notoriety as like a trashy political gossip miser guy. Fun fact, the Reynolds affair was not the last time that James Callender broke the story of a founding father's sex scandal. More on that later. During the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson literally hires James Callender to write up a bunch of crap about John Adams. And Callender goes at it. He makes up a whole bunch of stuff about John Adams, runs a vicious smear campaign against him. The most important lie that he tells is that he claims that Adams wants to go to war with the French, which is completely untrue, completely fabricated, but America hears that and they freak out. They're like, yo, I just got done fighting a war against the English like 20 years ago. I'm still tired from that. I don't want to go to war with the French. That sounds terrible. And so this completely BS statement by Callender is believed to have had a massive influence on how this actual election turned out. America! One of the more interesting things that Callender wrote about Adams during this election is that he behaved neither like a man nor a woman, but instead possessed a hideous hermaphroditical character. Now, threatening a dude's masculinity back then was a pretty serious thing to do because, you know, gender roles and all that. But then using that as a springboard to call someone's personality hermaphroditical was an entirely separate endeavor. It's kind of unclear if Callender is just comparing Adams to a hermaphrodite, or if he's like subtly accusing Adams of actually being one. But either way, this is a pretty scandalous thing to say about somebody. Unfortunately, before Callender has the opportunity to break some story about how Adams is totally and definitely a hermaphrodite, he was arrested and imprisoned for slander. However, his BS still did weigh very heavily upon the opinions of the American public. You know what, this joke has already gotten old and we still have so much more to go with this. You may be wondering what was going on with Aaron Burr and the Pinckney guy during all of this. Well, no one in the Federalist Party actually cared about Pinckney that much except for Hamilton, but he only cared about Pinckney just because he wanted literally anyone to be president over John Adams, and no one cared about Hamilton's opinion anymore either. So the Federalist Party was just kind of like, yo, Pinckney, we think you're cool, and, like, we'll vote for you to be vice president, but, like, we don't really care about you. We'll still vote for you in the Electoral College, but, like, we don't consider you worth our attention, so, sorry. A similar thing was happening with the Democratic Republicans and Aaron Burr. People liked Burr, but they just didn't think he was presidential material, especially when put next to Jefferson. However, unlike Pinckney, Burr kind of really wanted to be president, although he wasn't going to show that to people. And so, being constantly shut down in preference to Jefferson made him just a tad bit salty. Okay, I lied. It made him, like, a lot salty. So we are, like, how many minutes into this video? And I have finally reached the actual part of the actual election where people, like, vote and stuff. Wow.